no religion in history has been as closely tied to a land as has Judaism. That connection goes back almost 4,000 years from the first words of God to Abraham: leave your country, your birthplace, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. No sooner had he arrived than God said, to your offspring I will give this land. 7 times God promised the land to Abraham and promised it again to Isaac and Jacob. The word tshuva, often translated as repentance, literally means homecoming, in a double sense, spiritually to God and physically to the land of Israel. For Israel is the Jewish people's place of destiny, a tiny land for a tiny people, yet one whose role in religious history is vast. It's the land to which Moses and the Israelites traveled across the desert, the land from which they were exiled twice, the land to which our ancestors journeyed whenever they could, and which they never voluntarily left, never relinquished. Jewish history is the story of the longing for a land. The Holy Land remains the place where Jews were summoned to create a society of justice and compassion under the sovereignty of God. And though it was subsequently held holy by Christianity and Islam, the centers of these other faiths were elsewhere. For Western Christians, Rome; for Eastern Christians, Constantinople; and for Muslims, Mecca and Medina. There are 56 Islamic states today, 82 Christian ones, but only one Jewish state. It is the only place on earth where Jews are a majority, where they enjoy self-rule, where they are able to build a society and shape a culture as Jews. The Balfour Declaration in 1917, subsequently ratified by the League of Nations long before the Holocaust, was an attempt to rectify the lingering denial of a nation's right to its land and the subsequent persecution of Jews in country after country, century after century, in a history of suffering that has no parallel. The Jews who returned were not strangers, outsiders, an imperial presence, a colonial force. They were the land's original inhabitants, the only people in 4,000 years who created an independent nation there. All other occupiers of the land, from the Assyrians and Babylonians to the Ottomans and the British, were imperial powers who ruled the land as a district of their vast realms. The Egyptians didn't offer the Palestinians a state when they ruled Gaza between 1948 and 1967. Neither did the Jordanians when they ruled the West Bank during those years. The only nation to have offered Palestinians a state is the State of Israel. And every day we pray for its peace.
Good evening, everybody. We are here now for another illustrious guest for the 10 Steps to the New You series, none other than Rabbi Mordechai Becher, originally from Australia, presently from New Jersey, a few other places in between, which we're going to hear about, and his exciting life and how it connects to our topic for tonight, the topic of Israel. So first off, Rabbi Becher, how are you doing here tonight?
Great. Baruch Hashem, thank God, I'm doing fine.
That is great. And where are we finding you right now? Are you right now in New Jersey, in Australia, in Israel? Where in the world?
I am in Passaic, New Jersey, where I have been living for the past 20 years.
Wow, Passaic, New Jersey. I think I've heard of it. I've been there a few times. It's a little different than Cleveland, but it's, people who live there seem to like it. So,
okay.
So Becher, can you, I'm sure everyone here probably knows you already, but for the 2 or 3 people who might not, can you give us just a quick introduction, a background to who you are and to everything you've done in your life up until this point in 10 seconds or less?
You have to remind me, George Bernard Shaw gave a lecture in the United States. Someone asked him to give a survey of all of English literature. He said, "How long do I have?" And they said 15 minutes. He said, how can I tell you everything I know about English literature in 15 minutes? And they said, "Speak slowly, George." My father, Alav Shalom, was a Holocaust survivor from Poland. My mother, Alea Shalom, from England. They met in Australia after the war. And the family was very traditional. And I always remember my father's tefillin bag that he brought with him throughout the war. He kept his tefillin. And the bag had a Magen David. It was made by his mother, who was murdered by the Nazis. And it had on it a Magen David, Star of David, and the word Zion in the middle, and his name underneath. That very much said a lot about my father, Alav Hashalom. His passion for Israel that was actually he got from his parents in Poland, who he used to tell me that on Tu B'Shvat, the Jewish New Year of Trees, his father was able to obtain a crate of oranges from Israel, which were brought to Poland. So I went to a school called Bialik College in Melbourne, or in Australia. College refers to a school, elementary or high school. Bialik College was as you can know from the name, Chaim Nachman Bialik was a great Hebrew poet, and it was a Zionist day school. Very passionate. The principals, we used to call headmasters, were always Israeli, and most of the teachers were Israeli. And we used to learn Ivrit, we used to learn Israeli poetry, we used to learn Tanakh, the Torah, prophets and writings, the Bible. Very traditional place. We had an assembly every morning with the singing of the Australian national anthem, the Israeli national anthem, and the raising of both flags to a drum roll every morning. So that's the type of upbringing I had, which means from the earliest time that I remember, I wanted to go to Israel. I wanted to be an engineer, ideally aeronautical engineering. I went to a high school in Australia, Lubavitch High School in Australia, Yeshiva High School. And 2 weeks after I finished high school, I went to Israel. I got into engineering school, but I deferred my place for a year to go to study in Yeshiva in Israel, which was Yeshivas Itri, which I came upon by a series of fortuitous circumstances that we also call divine providence. Ended up in Itri with some close friends. One of the people you have on your lineup is Rabbi Menachem Nissel. We were together in Itri in 1978, 79. That's last century. And it was amazing. I loved the place. I loved Israel. I loved learning Torah, and decided to defer my place in engineering for another year and stay a second year. And after 2 years, I thought maybe I'll defer another year. And the university said, listen, we can't keep your place for 2 years. I said, well, what if I transfer to the general science faculty? They said, okay. So I transferred to the general science faculty without having actually stepped foot there. And I got another year deferment. After 3 years, I thought, I think I would like to continue in the Torah field. And I continued studying Torah for a while. And then, interestingly, I had an amazing meeting with as a rabbi who was organizing a program in Australia, educational program for a school in Sydney, Moriah College. That was a high school. And His name's Rabbi Revson, Rabbi David Revson, who's head of the Neve Yerushalayim Institute, who I work for now as well. And he was organizing this program. He was looking for guys to go. And I said, I would love to go. And I ended up going to Australia for a month to teach in this high school, at a camp at the high school, which is also where I met my wife, who's from Philadelphia, who was studying in Israel, was also sent to Australia. So we ended up dating there, and we met there. And after that experience, I decided that I wanted to teach. I enjoyed it. I thought I was reasonably good at it. And so I decided wanted to go into teaching. So we got married, and I studied for a while longer in Michigan. I was a student of Rabbi Mordechai Shapiro, who had a profound impact on me in many ways, and other rabbis as well, Rav Moshe Rom, Alav Shalom, Rav Asher Rubenstein. I learned B'Chevrusa with there. We had a lot of amazing teachers and great friends, great environment. My wife was at Hebrew University at the time, studying a graduate degree in psychology, and I was in yeshiva in a place, Jerusalem. Then so I decided to go into, we went back to Australia a number of times to teach on this program. It's called Counterpoint. Interesting circle is that when I was 13 in Bialik, was not really, completely observant. So Counterpoint was run in Melbourne by Yeshiva University. I'm now on the faculty at Yeshiva University. And I went, my sister and I went to Counterpoint, and she's 2 years older than me, and we both went to Counterpoint. And we both, at that time, made a decision to become religiously observant. My parents were delighted. They all went along with us and encouraged it, etc., and the whole family. And as a result of that, I went to the Lubavitch High School from Bialik. That's really, and of course, what's interesting is I met my wife on Counterpoint years later, and now I'm teaching in Yeshiva University in the same department that used to run Counterpoint in Australia years before. And I ended up teaching at Or Sameach, which is a tertiary institute of Jewish education in Israel, which teaches advanced Jewish education for people who don't have much of a background, but who are interested. Taught there for many years, eventually went to Toronto and taught for them in Toronto. We had an outreach synagogue. It was really a beginner's synagogue. Instead of a sermon on the Sabbath, I do a question and answer session. That's the type of place it was. And wonderful 4 years. We went back to Israel, and I was continued teaching at Or Sameach. Also used to teach at other places, a number of schools in Jerusalem. I also did army service, where I served in the chaplaincy of the Israeli army. I didn't do anything heroic, made sure that the food was kosher, for actually great units. I was the kashrut supervisor for the Duvdevan unit in Ramallah. I ran Seder. I read Megillah. I did, standard rabbinic stuff, answered people's questions in the middle of the night in the tent about why good things happen to bad people, etc., in the Golan Heights, right, and so on and so forth. And then we were in Israel until 2000, when I came to the United States, offered a job with a outreach organization called Gateways. And my teacher, Rabbi Moshe Shapiro, encouraged me. He felt it would be very good for me and the Jews to go to the States. Someone asked me why I went to the States. So there was a bank robber. I forgot who it was. Very famous bank robber. There's many in the United States. So, but someone asked him, "Why do you rob banks?" And he looked at them like, "Well, that's where the money is." Like, duh. So why I'm in America? So I teach English-speaking Jews Judaism. This is where most English-speaking Jews are. So after having lived in Australia, then Israel, then Toronto, Canada, and then moved back to Israel, we then came to the United States, to Passaic, where I've been working. I worked for Gateways for many years, and I also, about 11 years ago, I was hired by Yeshiva University, and I teach there Jewish history and philosophy. And I'm also involved in doing a doctorate in medieval Jewish history. and that's at Yeshiva University as well. In the Revel Graduate School, I did some graduate course in Islam in the theological Graduate School of Theology of Fordham University, and I did my master's also in medieval Jewish history. So now I've been here for 20 years. I have six children, thank God, and 3 of my sons served in the IDF. The oldest was in field intelligence. The next was in Givati, that's an infantry brigade. And the third he just finished recently. He was in the paratroopers. And 3 of my children who are married live in Israel. One is a lawyer, works in Tel Aviv, and his wife's a nurse. And they're a wonderful family. They live on a moshav called Neve Michael. My other son is in rabbinical school in Israel. He does construction in the summer. He's learning to be a rabbi, and his wife teaches at Schaffman's, and they've got children. They live in Israel. And my daughter lives in Israel. She's a nurse, and her husband is also in rabbinical school. And my son is two boys here, and my oldest is a firefighter.
Rabbi Becher, that is an amazing biography. When we were putting together this series, and I, we first met. I actually learned to North Sameach, and then subsequently in Eretz Yisrael. So we interfaced a few times in those years, and I knew that being a chaplain and a rabbi, that you were the one we had to speak on the subject. So thank you for giving the background that shows that you were in fact the thought leader that we want for this topic here tonight. So thank you for that. And so Rabbi Becher, we are talking about Israel, as we said. When you hear that word, that word can mean many different things to many different people. But for you, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word, quote, Israel, and why?
I think when I hear the word Israel, I think home. As Robert Frost put it, home is where they have to take you in whenever you want. And for the Jews, for most of history, we haven't had places like that. For a couple of thousand years, we've been in exile, and now we have we had a homeland for all of that time, but it wasn't home necessarily. The Ottomans were a little more accepting than others, but it was quite oppressive. There was a lot of corruption, taxation, etc. Under the English, they weren't letting us in even during the Holocaust. And so it was, but now I think of home, and it's also very emotional. When I drive along the New Jersey Turnpike, I don't know if people remember driving. I used to do that. And drive on the New Jersey Turnpike to give it actually a live class somewhere. I know this is shocking to some people, but I used to do that. And drive past Newark Airport. That's where planes used to fly out of to go to other places. And anytime I would always look over there, and if I would see an El Al plane with the Magen David on the tail, I always felt like, wow. I felt like pride and joy, and that's home. That's home. So I think that's how I feel about it. And it's interesting. The Maharal, one of the greatest of Jewish philosophers, said in Prague. He lived in Prague in the 16th century, I think it was. So the Maharal writes in the beginning. He wrote a book. He was one of the first people to write books about a general topic in Jewish thought. It was unusual at the time to have, until the Maharal. So he wrote, one of his books is called Netzach Yisrael. That means the eternity of Israel. And it's a book about exile and redemption. In the introduction to the book, he talks about exile as being an unnatural state. Unnatural for 3 reasons. A, he says, a nation is meant to be together. The Jews are scattered all over the world. There are Jews in Canada. I've heard that there are Jews in Cleveland, although I don't believe it. Right? There are Jews in New Zealand. There are Jews in South Africa. There's Jews everywhere. Right? Scattered. So he said that's unnatural. Second, he says it's unnatural for a nation not to be self-determining, not to have self-determination, to be subjugated to others, not to have independence. He says the Jews, for much of our history, have been subject to others. Sometimes they've been excellent. We've been subject to nations where it's been very wonderful, like the United States, Australia, etc. Often it hasn't been so good. But subjugation, not independent, not self-determining, unnatural. And third, it's unnatural not to be in your native land. Israel's our native land. So he says it is the way of unnatural things to eventually cease. Things go back towards their natural state. And he says the Jews will eventually come together. The Jews will eventually have independence and self-determination, and the Jews will eventually be back in Israel. So, yes, the largest concentration of Jews is in Israel. And we have self-determination and independence, and we are in our own native land. So there's something, when I see the Magen David on the El Al plain, right, and when I think about Israel and I hear that word, that's what I think of. It's a natural habitat. It's like a koala in a eucalyptus tree is a Jew in Israel. If I may be permitted to educate the Americans here, it is not a bear. It is not a koala bear. That is not correct. Not correct. It's a marsupial. It is not related to, so it's a koala. By the way, the eucalyptus tree is a tree that was transplanted to Israel. If you go to Israel today, there's eucalyptus trees all over the place, especially in the north and in the Chula region and other places. And eucalyptus trees have become but just part of the Israeli landscape, to the extent that there's a popular Israeli folk song. There was, probably not popular anymore, but there was a popular Israeli folk song that talked about Reach ha'eucalyptus, the smell of the eucalyptus, as being a typical Israeli smell, which is fascinating because, it's originally from Australia, but okay.
And Rabbi Becher, one of the passions that we both share is Jewish history. And we know that at least in modern Jewish history, the bringing over the eucalyptus tree to Israel has many stories with it. The famous story with Eli Cohen and how he would use the eucalyptus trees to identify the Syrian bunkers. And then you mentioned the Chula Valley and, the draining of the swamp and the re-wetting of it, or whatever it's called, when they put the water back.
Right.
That says eucalyptus trees definitely
plays a big role in Israeli history. Yes.
Yeah, in modern times for sure. But yeah, so that is our home. So, Rebecca, you've definitely dedicated so much of your life to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel, to the state of Israel, through both learning there and your army service there and your children's army service there, and now your children have made their own decision after your families come to the States to go back and settle there. So why is it that Israel's played such a key role in your life and life of your family?
Partially, to a great degree, it is due to the influence of our parents, who are very great lovers of both the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Both my wife's parents, Aleichem Shalom, and my parents of blessed memory. So that certainly plays an important role in why we are so, love Israel so much. But it's also more than that. It's the national project of the Jewish people is to create a Jewish society. You can live a very complete Jewish life in Borough Park, in Amsterdam, in Australia, in Golders Green, right? In other exotic locations, etc. But in all of those cases, you are not responsible for building the society and the country. The land of Israel is a place where Jews are responsible for building the society and the country. When you think about it, why do we even need a country? There are plenty of religions that don't have countries. Most religions don't have a country specifically. There are countries where the majority of the population live there, are of a specific religion, but that's not necessarily tied to the country, right? Buddhism, you can be a good Buddhist anywhere, right? Seattle, even in India, you could be a good Buddhist, right? You could be a good Christian living anywhere in the world. Right? You could be a good Muslim living anywhere else. It is true you would have to make pilgrimage at least once in your life, Hajj, to Mecca, but you could be a good Muslim living anywhere else. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. It's nowhere near Mecca. Right? But for Jews and Judaism, Israel is very central, very central. More than half of the commandments, we have 613 commandments in the Torah. Do not worry, folks. No one is obligated in all 613, unless you are male and female, single, married, divorced, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, all simultaneously. Sure, for many of our listeners in California, that's true. But for most of us, we're not obligated in all 613. But nevertheless, the majority of them are only applicable when the Jews are in Israel. That's pretty shocking. That means the majority of Judaism is Israel orientated. And Nachmanides tells us that even the ones that are not directly connected to the land of Israel, there is a greater depth and meaning and intensity to them when they're done in the land of Israel than there are done anywhere else. And so for me, it appears to me that the great project of the Jewish people is the construction of a Jewish society, a society based on Jewish values, on monotheism, on Jewish ethics, etc., etc. And the place that has been designated for that is the place where our history is. And that's the place where our destiny is. And that's the land of Israel.
Oh, beautiful. That's interesting, the idea about developing the land. So I'm sure you've read Michael Orn's book. So he speaks about how the early settlers, early Chalutzim, were motivated to start building the land because we know there's I think historians would agree, a mistake made in, I think, the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, that they relied on Arab workers to till the land. It wasn't until later, the third or fourth Aliyah, when the Jews started figuring out how to do it. But it was the idea actually came over in many ways from the Protestants who believed that the Jews had to settle the land for their Messiah to come. And one of the key people really in convincing the Jews was a convert. We spoke about this. We did a series recently called Righteous Converts, but Warder Crescent, the first consulate to Jerusalem, was one of the people who really brought this idea over. The Jews have to develop the land. It has to be the Jews developing the land. And he failed in that regard in the colony that he tried to build, but he was many credit him with coming up with the idea of the kibbutz and really getting Jews involved with getting their hands dirty with the land and not relying on others to do it. So that's a fascinating idea you're saying.
I don't think the idea started with Warder Crescent. I think it started much earlier than that, and I think it's a major part and that's a second aspect of why the land of Israel is so important, and why I believe, because Jews are not meant to be isolated in a bubble environment, studying Torah in a pristine, like in the desert during the 40 years in the desert, man falling from heaven, surrounded by clouds, no involvement in this world. No, that's not what Judaism is about. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch and others say that one of the purposes of us going to Israel was to get our hands dirty. This idea goes back way before the early Zionists, way before Warder Crescent, way before. It goes to the idea that Judaism is to show, and the land of Israel, one of the purposes of the land of Israel is to be able to invest every aspect of life with Judaism. So that and as Rav Hirsch puts it so eloquently, he says that it's to be a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, of militarists and of scientists, of agriculture and of culture, and all of that imbued with the ethics of the Torah and the belief in God, to show the entire world that there's no specific type of personality, character trait, or talent that is dedicated to God. Anyone of any type can be. And that's what Israel is, the lab in which the Jews are supposed to be working land. I'm reminded of the story that when the Carmel winery produced its first batch of wine in Israel, Rishon LeZion, Montefiores, etc. So when they produced their first batch of wine in Israel in the 19th century, so they sent as a present crates to various Jewish dignitaries. One of the people they sent it to was the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, known as the Netziv, whose one son, Reb Chaim Berlin, who was a rabbi in Moscow, has a yeshiva named after him in New York. His other son, Meir Berlin, whose name he changed his name to Meir Bar Ilan, has a university named after him in Israel, in Ramat Gan. So the Netziv was a major supporter of the religious Zionists and of the settlement of the land of Israel. And not for any Protestant reason. He was a Rosh Yeshiva in Lithuania, right? And when he heard that the crate of wine had arrived, he said, wait. He went and he put on his Shabbat, Sabbath clothing. He went out to greet the wine. When he held a bottle of wine in his hand and saw a label printed in Hebrew, it says, produced in Eretz Yisrael, in the land, there was no state yet. It was called the land of Israel. Produced in Eretz Yisrael, he started crying. Wine produced by Jews in the land of Israel. You know, in biblical imagery, when the prophets wanted to describe someone who is living in tranquility and peace and prosperity, they'd describe it as ish tachat gefano, under his vine. The vines of grapes in the land of Israel. And here for 2,000 years, that hadn't happened. Mm-hmm. So there's an amazing, and that is part of what we're supposed to do, right? To work the land, to be a Jewish electrician and a plumber and garbage collection and the army and all that, right? And imbue it with Judaism.
Right. Yeah. No, 100%. And, you know, I guess I would alter my statement based on what you're saying, and that some of the early Chalutzim maybe got it wrong, and that they didn't realize that all these things had to be Jewish. And once they start to realize that, no, everything has to be, it's going to be the Jews who have to develop the land and the Jews who have to develop the army, that's what will lead to where we are today. Which kind of segues into another topic I want to touch on, that we have here today, this state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, which is governed by a British parliamentary system, loosely based on Jewish ideas. You know, let's face it. We had the Anshe Knesset Hagadolah who governed the Second Temple, the beginning of the Second Temple time period. The name was taken Knesset to be the parliament in Israel. The Anshe Knesset Hagadolah had 120 members. The Knesset in Israel has 120 members. The Anshe Knesset Hagadolah is made up of great sages and scholars and Talmidei Chachamim, and the Knesset in Israel has 120 members. And I think it ends there. But so, anyways, we have our state, which is based on sort of a British quasi-socialist, quasi-capitalist mishmash of different political structures. But definitely it's not when we open up the Torah, and especially the Nevi'im, and start to look at what the political structure of Eretz Yisrael is supposed to be like, who we're supposed to have at the head of the government, the way the country's supposed to be. So we have sort of the idealistic state of Israel painted by the Torah, with Mashiach, with a king. Mashiach means king. Many people think it means something else, but it means a king of Israel, a monarchy, a benevolent monarch with a Sanhedrin, with the court system. So we definitely believe in the balance of powers, the Kohanim, the priesthood, and we don't have a lot of that today. So as somebody who spent so much time in Israel, both Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, and on both sides of the fence, so to speak, what's the path for the Jewish people? And I'm asking this question from a Rambam perspective, right? The Maimonides tells us that the Messianic era will not be miraculous, will not be signs and wonders. It'll come about through natural means. So what's the path for the Jewish people forward? So I know this is a loaded question, but what's the path forward?
Well, you answered the question. You've answered the question. The path will be indeed through natural means, meaning the more religious Jews imbued with Jewish ideology become involved in every aspect of the state of Israel, then the closer it will move to the Jewish reality. It's not like by a miraculous feat that will happen. It needs us to be involved more. And I should point out, although the state of Israel is not ideal, it's far from ideal, and certainly certainly not messianic. But I think there's a tremendous amount of Jewish values that are actually exhibited in the behavior of the state of Israel. I'll give you some examples of that. You go to an army headquarters anywhere. I spoke in McGuire Air Force Base once for a group of chaplains. As a former Israeli chaplain, I spoke to a group of chaplains in the United States Air Force and sold them my book, which they bought a few hundred copies for chaplains in the United States Army and Air Force. And one of the things I noticed there was the abundance of medals on people's chests. I was sitting there speaking to a group of chaplains, and they were like covered with medal. Like, what do you do? Kusher a pot and, like 8 matzah. I mean, what? But and you go to army bases almost anywhere in the world, and you will see people walking around with masses of medals. I mean, it's like Israel. You go to the top army bases. I have a nephew also who he works in the Air Force, fairly, and you go to the Central Command in Tel Aviv. You don't see people with lots of huge amounts of medals. A little, parachute thing there. You feel a few falafel on the shoulder. That's what they call them. Or you have the bars, which they call coffins. That's what they call them in Israel. Coffins, aronot, right? Or falafel. We don't glorify warfare. It is true Israel's been ruled by WASPs for much of its history, white Ashkenazi socialist paratroopers, WASPs. But the fact is we don't have a glorification of war in the same way that's a Jewish value, right? Massive military parades, huge amounts of medals. That's just not part of it. Not part of it. That's a Jewish value. Secondly, philanthropy. The state of Israel is in the forefront of worldwide aid, whether it's agricultural aid to Africa, whether it is medical development of medical technology and development of drugs and development of high-tech industry. Israel, and a lot of this is done there's a lot of philanthropy. Israel is very often the first country to send a mobile medical unit to areas of disasters, whether it was Haiti or Turkey or it doesn't matter where. And Israel has even offered to countries with which it has no diplomatic relations. They refuse because they hate Israel more than they love their own children, as Golda Meir pointed out. But nevertheless, Israel's in the forefront. So that's a Jewish value, the value of tzedakah, charity, giving, etc., etc. So I think there is a lot of hope, and I think in polls that have been done, a lot of Israelis are quite warm towards Jewish tradition. Not so warm towards Jews, but warm towards Jewish tradition, right? And there's an understanding, Ben Gurion, completely secular, very hard to get more secular than David Ben Gurion, first Prime Minister of Israel. He had a Tanakh, a Bible study session in his office every week. Menachem Begin continued that tradition. Netanyahu used to have a parasha class in his home on Shabbat. So yeah, that's impressive, and there is something that a lot of Israelis recognize that. As anyone who's in the army will know, at the end of basic training, when you have your they finish. So all my sons, you finish the long whatever it is 40-kilometer hike. It's I don't know what it's called, the Masa Kumta they call it. That means where you take it's a hike is too mild a word, but whatever, right? And they're handed in the ceremony a gun and also a Tanakh, Hebrew Bible. This is my copy of that's the Israeli. You can see the symbol of the Israeli army.
Wow.
And that's the official, and you can see on here it says L'chayalei Tzahal, soldiers of the Israeli army. So one of the commanders, my son who is in Givati, Pinchas, who lives in Israel as a lawyer, he was given this. The officer said, I'm giving you the gun. This is how you fight. I'm giving you this. This is what you fight for. These values. So that is something which, and there is a fair amount of that. So we are true. We're not there yet, as everyone. No one will disagree that we're there yet. There's no one who says this is it. This is the ideal, right? No, right. But I think our involvement, our passion, and our involvement in all walks of life can only serve to bring it closer to that ideal.
Beautiful, beautiful. So along those lines, I'm here in Cleveland right now. You're in Passaic, New Jersey. We're both interacting with Jews, English-speaking Jews, on a regular basis. What is our role as educators, and more specifically for our listeners here tonight? What is the role of the Jews living outside of Israel to the land of Israel? What should the relationship look like?
Well, there's a verse in Jeremiah Jeremiah says, Sion hi, doresh ein la. Zion has no one seeking her out. And the Talmud tells us, we see from here that it needs to be sought out. Doresh ein la miklal deboy drisha. It needs to be sought out. The word drisha, to seek it out, has a few meanings. I think one meaning is, lidrosh is to study it, what we're doing now, to study Israel. Right? If a Jew doesn't know where Jerusalem is, if a Jew doesn't know where the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried, if a Jew doesn't know where a place called Rosh Amana is, if a Jew doesn't know, so that means you don't know part of your own history. So we need to teach, right? When I was in school, in elementary school, I was about to say in my day, that's because I'm old. But when I was in elementary school, right, we were in economics, we were buying shares in the newly developed wheel. But we were taught the geography of the land of Israel. Every kid in our school knew the geography of Israel. We knew geography of Australia as well, and Asia, because that's where we are, right? But we knew geography of Israel. Right? I could tell you where the Yarkon River is, and so on and so on, the Golan, and so that's important stuff, right? I think so. Drisha, but drisha means learning also about the commandments of Israel, the sanctity of Israel. There's a lot of Torah. There's a lot of Jewish knowledge about the land of Israel, whether it is mystical, whether it is legal stuff, whether it is historical. So that's number one meaning, lidrosh. Zion, to seek out Zion, that's number one. Number two, drisha means prayer. In Nachmanides says that when Rivka went batelech lidrosh et Hashem, she went to seek out God. Nachmanides says that means she went to pray. Prayer for Israel. An average Jew, I haven't counted it up, but an average Jew who prays, we mention Israel and Jerusalem hundreds of times a week. Every time you have something made of wheat, barley, rye, spelt, oats, figs, dates, pomegranates, right, olives, wine, right, etc. We say a blessing that includes prayers for Israel, prayers for Jerusalem. With a normal Jew is a fanatic about Israel, right? Because but we have to think about that when we say it. Synagogues supposed to be facing the land of Israel, and they are. I've traveled all over those in, South Korea and Japan 2 summers ago. I was in India the summer before that, Panama the winter before that, Vietnam, Thailand, Australia, South Africa, etc., Russia. And anywhere you go, the older synagogues and even newer ones, all orientated towards the land of Israel, right? Wow. That's something we should keep in mind. Right? A lot of people don't think about that, but it's I think we should be thinking it. So part of our prayer is about the land of Israel. And if you read a lot of the prayers we say in traditional Judaism, a lot of it, just a huge amount of it is about Israel. Right? The third meaning of lidrosh, to seek it out, is literally seek it out. Meaning, go there and visit when you can. I buy Israeli produce whenever I can. Right? If my wife is in Costco and she sees Israeli carrots, man, she's going to buy it. We take tithes, which is not hard to do. It's easy to do, right? But it's not an excuse not to buy it, right? We see Israeli clementinas, we buy it. Medjool dates, we buy them. Israeli wines are fantastic. My gosh, right? I always buy Israeli wines.
Israel bonds.
I used to get Israel bonds as like a long time ago, but buy Israeli produce, right? There's a whole bunch of anti-Semites, right, out there, BDS movement and other scumbags who would love to destroy Israel economically, politically, and militarily, right? The Jewish people are the ones who are seeking out Zion. One of the ways we do that is by our support for Israel in any way we can, whether it's financially, whether it's with our votes, whether it's with our purchases, whether it's our trips there, our tourism, and so on and so forth. I think that's an incredibly central part. So those are three areas. A, to study the Torah of the land of Israel. B, prayer. And C, actively, physically seeking out and helping the land of Israel.
Beautiful, beautiful. Rabbi Becher, you've been very generous with your time. I've already kept you for longer than I promised, which, as they say, an optimist is somebody when the rabbi says, in conclusion, puts their shoes back on. So, but just one last question before we wrap it up here tonight. If I was to give you a gigantic billboard on let's say in your New Jersey Parkway, or here in Cleveland, we'll say on Cedar Road, and you could put anything on this billboard to promote your views of Israel, what would that billboard say?
Aside from buying my book. Okay, right. Okay, anyway. So our future is where our past is. Right? And I think that's what I'd probably do. Our future, the destiny of the Jewish people, is where our past is. Right? And that's true in terms of our faith. Right? Our future is in our past, right? And it's also true geographically, right? That will soon become the majority of Jews demographically in the next 10, 15 years or something like that. I think the majority of the Jewish population will be in Israel. Right? Certainly that's the center of Torah study, books produced, in so many areas, creativity, Jewish song, etc. That's I think what I'd probably put on the on the billboard, etc. And obviously my face.
With the book.
Yeah. To remember.
So Rabbi Becher, I think we have to send a copy of tonight's talk to the Dalai Lama. There's the famous book, The Jew and the Lotus, where the Dalai Lama writes about how the Dalai Lama came to American Jewish leaders. He was bothered by how his people could survive in exile.
That's right.
30 years in exile at the time. And he looked at us 2,000 years in exile, and he says, how do we do it? I think, Rabbi Becher, tonight we've really covered that. And I want to thank you for that, because you've I think, expressed how for us, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is central, is paramount, is tied up in one. And, along the lines of what you're saying, one thing I always remind all of my students of is that where we are right now, whether you're here in Cleveland or watching on Torah anytime and wherever in the world, and it's not in Israel, we have to remember that we are a nation in exile, as we alluded to, or we spoke out very much tonight. We're a nation in exile. That's what we are. We're not a religion. We're not a people. We're not an ancient people. We are a nation in exile. And the ideal for us is in the land of Israel. And hopefully these lessons we shared tonight will help everyone to be focused on that. So we focus on our path to get back to Israel. I've said for a long time that my youngest now is 6. I've said by the time she graduates high school in 12 years, by the way, high school is what they call it here in the States. I think you call it college in Australia.
Yes, I've heard of high school. Yes.
Yeah, right. So I say I want to be in Israel. With as crazy as things are getting now politically, maybe it'll be sooner. Who knows? By the way, I mean crazy politically in both places. But if they're crazy everywhere, I want to be in Israel. That's for sure. Yeah. So
we prefer our own craziness than someone else. Yeah.
Exactly. So you've helped us to really bring this point home, Rabbi Becher. So before we let you go back to your busy schedule, any parting thoughts for our listeners here tonight?
Any parting thoughts? Yeah.
Besides to buy your book.
No. But Jews think about Israel. We think about Jerusalem. It should be on our consciousness. We can achieve that. Think a little about it when we pray and say it. Don't just say it, but think about it. Think about it in our learning and our study of Judaism, how much of it revolves around Israel, how much is involved in Israel, and think of it in our practical life, whether it's buying Israeli wine or bamba or bisli and the other fruits Israel is blessed with. That's what I would say. Keep it in our mind. Zion, as Jeremiah said, Doresh Ein, no one's seeking it out, and the only people who will seek it out are us. That's our job.
Beautiful. Rabbi Becher, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for your time here tonight. This was amazing. And again, if anyone wants to seek out Rabbi Becher, first of all, you should buy his book, Gateways to Judaism. Many of you who back when we used to meet in person at Partners in Torah, you know that those books were frequently available there on the counter. And again, you should buy your own now that we're not meeting in person. But you can reach out to Rabbi Becher on LinkedIn. He's active in the LinkedIn community. And again, from the bottom of my heart,
YU Torah Anytime.
YU Torah Anytime. This, of course, many of you are viewing this on Torah Anytime here tonight. And they, by the way, yes, they do get upset at us if we don't mention Torah Anytime at least, once per every 5 minutes. But thank you very much, Rabbi Becher, and I look forward to being able to do this again in the future.
I mean, thank you. Pleasure. Thank you for hosting me.
Thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Thank you for being with us to the end. It is a true pleasure to have you all here for yet another episode of 10 Steps to the New You. This is our third to last episode. Next week, God willing, we will have Rabbi Ephraim Shapiro speaking on the topic of Kiddush Hashem, which means sanctifying God's name in public. And then concluding I think it'll be the third day of Pesach, the fourth night of Pesach, coming after the third day, we will have the concluding episode with Rabbi Steve Berg, the CEO of Aish International, of Aish Torah, and that'll be on the topic of responsibility. We are getting geared up for our next series, so stay tuned for what that'll be. And let's just jump into discussion. First of all, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, good jokes, even bad jokes, feel free to unmute yourself, turn your camera on, please, so everyone can see your shining face. You could type it in the chat box, and let's see what people have to say before I jump into a few closing thoughts. Anyone, don't be bashful. So I see there's a chat here. Oh, nice Israel Bonds shout out. Yes, I am a big Israel Bonds fan for a number. You know what? I'll tell you a few things about Israel Bonds. Michael Halb is not here tonight, but I believe Joanne is a board member, so she can tell him that I gave a big shout out. But you know, Israel Bonds are, first of all, we're very lucky to be in Ohio. Those of us in Ohio, where the state of Ohio buys a significant amount of Israel bonds. But be as it may, I'll tell you a couple interesting stories about Israel bonds. I'm in the middle of a fascinating book right now, and I mean this both in a good way and a bad way. It's fascinating, a good way and a bad way. It's called The People's History of America, and it talks about different time periods. It talks about really from 1492 until the present, and it highlights Cuba and the relationship that Cuba had with America, and et cetera, et cetera. And when Fidel Castro and the communists took over in Cuba, the Jews obviously, really everyone entered a very difficult state. Anyone who had any wealth was suppressed by the communist government. And for the Jews, they started leaving Cuba in droves. And, they then went to populate Miami, and that's Miami's now a little Cuba, or a little Havana. But there's all kinds of stories told about wealthy people who were wealthy in Cuba before the communists took over, who, when the communists took over, they took literally everything they have. They nationalized the bank accounts, nationalized everything, nationalized all the businesses. The one thing they didn't bother touching was Israel bonds, because they're like, what did Fidel Castro want from your Israel bonds? So there were many wealthy Cuban Jews who were able to rebuild their lives from the Israel bonds that they had purchased. Now, let's just paint the picture. In 1948, at the first issue of Israel bonds, Ben Gurion and other officials went to major Jewish population centers, to Miami, to New York, to Chicago, to hold dinners to get people to buy Israel bonds. At that point, everyone thought it was a charity. No one in their wildest dreams thought that it was a decent investment. They thought it was a charity, but people lined up around the corner to buy Israel bonds. And you see in the case of this Cuban gentleman that was the only thing that saved him financially, was that he had so many Israel bonds. Now, it's also interesting to point out that Israel has never defaulted on an issue of bonds. I remember my dad, who is on the class with us, retired financial planner. Joanne and Mikhail, please don't repeat this to Michael, because I don't want to get in trouble. My father would always make the point how it used to be very hard to deal with the CompuShare. That's what they call it now. I don't know what they call it in those days, but the company that manages Israel bonds, especially when it came to inheritance, and redeeming could be quite hard sometimes. Nowadays, it's very easy. I'll tell you, CompuShare has gotten their act together, and it's very, very easy to buy bonds, very, very easy to redeem bonds. And hey, look at their rates. It's one of the most solid investments with basically, if you look at the history, almost no risk. You can get 1 year, I think 1 year is the smallest, up to 15-year bonds. And again, I'm not saying this from a support Israel standpoint. I believe in supporting Israel, and you're supporting Israel. From a financial standpoint, like, we're also going to get almost a 3% return on a 15-year bond. You're not going to get that from any other country. And before COVID, and hopefully as the economy continues to recover, they were upwards of, I think, 4 or 5% with some of their longer bonds. And again, I believe because it's a great investment, and it's as a way to support the land of Israel. So I'm a big believer in Israel bonds. But that's not really the topic tonight. The topic tonight is Israel in general. So that was just a way of telling you a little bit of an interesting story. I'm sorry, Joanne actually sparked that, was saying she liked the Israel bond shout out. So we'll blame it on Joanne if you don't like my little shameless plug for Israel bonds. By the way, I'm not getting a commission on this, but if you would like to buy Israel bonds and dedicate them to Partners in Torah, you can do that. It's a great way to make a donation, a dedication to Partners in Torah, buy an Israel bond, give it to Partners in Torah. We'll be happy to take it. Okay, before I go on with some other closing thoughts, any other questions, thoughts on tonight? So I'll share with you one just closing thought that I think many of us have probably been debating it. It's an existential debate that the Jewish people have had, and for sure in Israel have had, probably since 1948, but definitely into modern times. And I was having it just today. I was in a Clubhouse room. As many of you know, I've gotten involved with the Clubhouse app and trying to teach a little Torah over there and be involved in some good Jewish conversations over there. So we were having a conversation about self-determination and nationalism, and Israel being a nationalistic state versus Israel being a democracy. And that's a conundrum. You know, when we're talking about the modern state of Israel, the state of being a democracy and a Jewish state is a conundrum. It is an issue that quite possibly will come to a head. In other words, if the Arabs / Muslims / non-Jews / Palestinians, whatever name you want to call it, if the non-Jews, let's say, living in the state of Israel, or even outside the state of Israel, realize that the citizenship in Israel is open to anyone, and it's not terribly hard to get citizenship. It's maybe not easy, but it's not hard. And they realize that they can really overthrow the state of Israel through a democratic process. And there have been many great countries overthrown through democratic processes. And when I mean overthrow, I mean take control of and do away with the Jewish character. Technically, it can happen. I mean, we saw in the last election, the joint list got, I believe, 15 seats out of 120. That's more than 10% if you do your math. We have another elections coming up, elections part 5 or 6. I forget what we're up to now. Coming up, sorry, my Alexa's having trouble connecting to the internet. Part 5 or 6 or wherever we're up to in the elections. And look, if they ever got their act together and said, let's all become citizens of Israel and vote in the elections, they could get up to 30, 40, 50, 61 seats. And at that point, there goes the Jewish state. At that point, any legislature could, God forbid, be passed. And you don't know what could happen. So I think it's important to realize that, especially as Americans, I think everyone in the class tonight is from America. Well, Rabbi Jacoby is originally from Canada, but at least everyone here now is living in America. And we're so, I don't know what the right word is. They're so crazy in a good way. I can't think of a good adjective, but crazy in a good way. We'd say it in Yiddish as Meshuggah b'isa davar, or Hebrew, Meshuggah b'isa davar. They were crazy about American democracy. And America is a great democracy. And many wars have been fought to preserve American democracy, either in America or in countries who wanted to have American democracy or whatever it is. We have to realize Israeli democracy is not the same. Yes, it's a democratic country. Yes, it's the most democratic country in the Middle East. But first of all, it's a parliamentary system. It's not a system like we have. That's one of the reasons why we've had so many elections lately. But at a certain point, it's a conundrum. And I am a firm believer, and I'm comfortable saying it public like we are right now, that the Israeli government has to do whatever possible to preserve the Jewish character of the state of Israel. If the state of Israel loses its Jewish character, God forbid, it's lost everything. It's lost everything. It's lost its divine protection, and it'd be a slippery slope till it wouldn't be here anymore. So I think that the governments have to keep an eye on that. At the same time, there have to be equal rights for non-Jewish citizens. In other words, just because, whether or not Israel gets to a quota system with non-Jewish population, which I think it should have. Again, I don't want to sound like a bigot, but I think it should have that. I think there should be a quota system of the country will never have more than, 40% non-Jewish citizens. And we can discuss that a little bit. But at the same time, it can't be that they're not treated, that they don't, even if, let's say we hit that quota and 40% citizenship. So that doesn't mean that citizen or non-citizen number 41, making the beginning of the 41%, does not have the equal rights of a citizen. There needs to be some quasi state where taxation without representation, but they're treated completely fair, because that is, as we talked about in the class, that's the state of Israel. Even though it's not a Torah state per se, it is a Jewish state. And therefore, as a Jew, we treat everybody fairly, whether they're part of us or just dwelling amongst us. So I think that's a very important point right there. And I'll say one last thing, and then Joanne threw a question there, which I think is a very good question, and I want to discuss that. But there's another existential debate I've been having recently. Rabbi Spiro and I had it on the Rabbi's podcast last week. And that is that, as we mentioned tonight, and as I mentioned regularly, that we are the first Jews in 2,500 years who can look to see the majority of the world Jewish population living in Israel. That's something that they could not say in the first temple, right? Judah Maccabee could not say that, and we can say that. And I would like to think that this is definitely part of the messianic path, though I can't say that for sure. I can't. There's just not enough said about the messianic path, and I can't say it. I know there are religious Zionists who do put messianic meaning into the present day situation. I do not. I don't think that is accurate from a Jewish philosophical standpoint, from looking at the words of our sages. That being said, I truly believe we are definitely in the process, and we have to kind of wait and see. But the existential question I've sort of been pondering in my head is, let's say, we'll get to Joanne's question in a minute, and Michael and Mikhail's point in a moment. But let's just say, God forbid, Israel would cease to exist tomorrow, or cease to exist as a Jewish state, go to become Palestine or whatever, God forbid. What would that mean for the Jewish people? So I would say like this: we are the Am Kashei Oref. We are the stiff-necked people. That's a blessing and curse. We have survived everything. We've survived the destruction of temples, both 1 and 2. We survived centuries of Roman persecution. We survived centuries of Christian persecution. We survived the Crusades. We survived the Reconquista of Spain. We survived the Khmelnytsky massacres in Poland and Ukraine. We survived the onslaught of the Enlightenment from a philosophical perspective. We survived the pogroms of Russia. We survived the Holocaust, the largest scaled genocide attempt in the history of the world. So yes, it would throw us into a state of national depression that might take us forever to get out of, but the Jewish people would still survive. And I'm not worried about that. So I think that's an important point to put into this discussion. Okay, I want to jump down here to these questions. So Joanne types over here, but do you think something like that would work? Wouldn't there be an outcry from the world at large? Quite possibly. But what's the alternative? And that's really the discussion I was having today. I don't know what the alternative is. In other words, like this: Israel today, as I think Mikhail started to put there, when is Israel going to open up fully? Oh, okay, we'll get to open up fully in a minute. So as Rabbi Becher mentioned, that Israel is the most philanthropic state in the world, just about maybe outside of America, with the support that they give at the time of crisis throughout the world, offering things to their enemies, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say, Joanne, to your question, like, where's it gotten us? Where's our benevolence to our enemies gotten us? Where is the fact that we will treat Syrians who are injured in the Syrian war, who make their way to the borders of Israel and Israeli hospitals? Where's it gotten us? Now, that doesn't mean we should stop. God forbid, I agree with Rabbi Becher. We should double our efforts to help out world powers and use whatever we have as a country to help other countries. I believe in that firmly. But I'll tell you a great quote that I once heard from Richard Joel. Richard Joel is the immediate past president of Yeshiva University. He's also the father of Rabbi Joel from Mizrahi, the headmaster of Fuchs Mizrahi School. And
Hillel.
What's that?
The former head of Hillel. He's my old boss.
Right. I'm sorry. He's the former head of Hillel, then the president of Yeshiva University. Now he's retired. So I remember I was speaking to him a couple of years ago about, I'll say it now. It was it's kind of funny in retrospect that it was one of the situations where the Almighty was looking out and protected us. But I had reached out to a certain person to be a scholar, to be a keynote speaker at one of our events. And I had certain concerns based on this person's lifestyle, not huge concerns, but certain concerns. And I knew that Yeshiva University had this person speak at their graduation. So I reached out to Rabbi Joel, to Dr. Joel, to Richard Joel. And I said, like, did you get any flack for that because of X, Y, and Z? Like, this is a person who's not a young man, and he has a non-Jewish girlfriend who's like younger than me. And maybe she's Jewish, but whatever. He's not married to her. And I said, like, did you get any flack for that? And he said, no, not really. And he said, but really, you can't worry about flack. You can't always be looking over your shoulder. If you always look over your right and your left shoulder, eventually you're going to hit the pole in front of you, right? And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that with Israel. That yes, we have to bend over backwards to be a benevolent country, to maintain the Jewish concept of tzedakah and helping the nations of the world and being there, the first ones on the ground in Haiti and Indonesia and wherever it might be, and working towards the Abraham Accords and other peace accords, etc. 100%. But, and here's just my big but, and again, I'm not involved in Israeli politics. I don't think I ever will be, even when I hopefully get there, if it is before Mashiach comes, before the Messiah comes. I don't have any plans to get involved in politics. But I would hope that if that 12% or whatever it is that of the Knesset that is made up by the joint list starts to get higher and higher and higher, I would hope that something will be there to protect the Jewish character of the country. And I don't think, and again, I agree with you, Jordan. Yes, there will be outcry from the world, but there's outcry anyways. Like we at a certain point, I can't sleep. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I had any say in the matter, think of all those Israeli soldiers who've given up their lives to fight in the armies, to fight in the ongoing war of independence, as I once heard from Gordis. I'm blinking on his first name, Rabbi Gordis. Blanking on his name, Rabbi Gordis, written a number of books. Daniel Gordis, thank you, Chaya and Slain, thank you. Daniel Gordis was speaking here, I believe, at an APAC event, and he's a wonderful speaker. And he said that we talk about how many wars there have been in Israel, and it depends on how you count. What's a war? What's a conflict? How long? But whatever. He said there's been one war. He said it's all the War of Independence. It just has a reprieve and comes back, because anyone who we're fighting with in the War of Independence are people we have not come to peace terms with, we have not come to peace treaties with, right? Until this past year, there had not been a single peace treaty since 1990, since Jordan in 1990, right? And therefore he says that it's just the most recent battle in the War of Independence, and it's true. And that's why when we talk about the Jewish sovereignty in Israel, when we talk about the religious undertones of the modern day state of Israel, why my personal position is to kind of be a middle of the roader in this regard, that I don't say that we're there where I'm going to put religious emphasis on it. It means so much so that look at Yom HaAtzmaut as a religious holiday as much as a nationalistic holiday. But on the flip side, I'm not going to say nothing's happening, because we're living in miraculous times, and that a lot of that comes from these issues that while we are sovereign, it's far from uncontested, right? Okay, I mean, we've come a long way this past year. Let's face it, a long way. Going to, and I believe we've announced this yet. We haven't fully rolled it out, but I'll go ahead and let you guys know that the annual event for Partners in Torah this year, which will be, God willing, April 25th, Sunday, April 25th, one of the keynote speakers is going to be the United Arab Emirates ambassador to America, Yusuf Obata. I think I pronounced that right. Maybe not. I don't remember. I'll have to get it right before the event. But we're having the UAE ambassador speak. Like if I had told you a year ago or 2 years ago, hey, guess what? At a Partners in Torah event, we're going to have the United Arab Emirates ambassador speak, and we're going to have a conversation with him and Malcolm Hoenlein, the immediate past president of the Council of Jewish Presidents. Conversation with the two of them, which I think is going to be fascinating. But if I had told you that 2 or 3 years ago, or even 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, or after in the middle of the Oslo War, as I call it, never call it the Intifada. No Jew should ever call it the Intifada, right? Intifada means shaking off filth. Don't call it the Intifada. You can call it the Oslo War, right? It was a war sparked by the failed Oslo Accords. But anyways, it's amazing. But and if you remember back to a class we gave, I believe about a year ago, towards the beginning of the pandemic. Actually, it was on Yom HaAtzmaut at the beginning of the pandemic, so just about a year ago. I always make the point of why is the 10th of Nisan not a holiday? And why is the day that the Beis HaMikdash was dedicated, the temple in Israel, the Solomon's temple dedicated, not a holiday? And why is the day that, take your pick for the second temple, there's Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, whatever date you want to pick, why is that not a holiday? And it was never a holiday. These days were never holidays. And not only that, but it's a debate amongst the medieval commentators if during the Second Temple, they still fasted the fast days for the morning of the First Temple, because the Second Temple was not the First Temple. And as we mentioned, it wasn't the majority world Jewish population, but they didn't celebrate it. So whatever we have today, which is, again, we've achieved some things they didn't have during the Second Temple with population wise, but on the flip side, we don't have the temple, we don't have the Kohanim, the priests, and we don't have the level of sovereignty that we had during the Second Temple. Again, the Second Temple has problems. Don't get me wrong, So, but if then they didn't make a holiday, and all the more so, really, I think it's a better example from the first temple. 10th of Nisan was the day that Joshua crossed the Jordan River and went into the land of Israel. Okay, you want to say the day that he subdued all the Canaanite nations, whatever date that was, not a holiday. So if those were not holidays and never made holidays, and there was no religious expression given to those days, then I think that that far be it from us at this point in time to put religious expression onto what's going on. On the flip side, again, they had to sit hand in hand. To say we're not living in amazing times and we don't have to thank Hashem on a daily basis for everything we have and for every time we get to go to the land of Israel, how, again, pre-pandemic, and as Rabbi Friedman said last week, and hopefully it'll happen sometime soon, that I could take this used to be a little piece of plastic. For me, it's my phone, and swipe it and buy a ticket for, by the way, American Airlines starting service to Israel. And I just got my daughter a round trip ticket for, I think, $600 or something like that. But like for like a little bit of money comparative to the vast wealth in America, we can go to Israel and be there in 12 hours. Or again, we live in Cleveland, so you have to have a layover and all that. So they say 20 hours, whatever it takes. But still, every time I get there, I'm filled with emotion. I'm filled with emotion thinking about what would my great grandfather say, who I'm named for? What would my great great grandfather, whose Kiddush cup I use every Friday night, who came from Lithuania, who was the first of our family to immigrate to America, of whom my father is named after? What would he say if he knew that he would have a Yalla would be his great 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 granddaughter studying in the land of Israel, and a great grandson who studied for a couple years in the land of Israel, and kids and grandkids who can fly to Israel whenever they want to? So the halachic question of religious expression, I think we're not ready for it. On the flip side, the philosophical question of hakaras hatov, of appreciation to the Almighty and appreciation to the modern day state of Israel for everything we have, 100%. Okay, let me get down to some of these questions because I kind of went off on a tangent there. So Mikhail, when is Israel going to open up fully? Enough of the scamdemic measures. Don't everyone get a vaccine? Didn't everyone get a vaccine by now? Okay, Mikhail, that's already toned down for you, Mikhail. I was impressed that you held back a little bit in that comment. But you can just, I got my second vaccine today, by the way. I'm now fully vaccinated. If anyone would like a hug, then come over here. Men only, please. You can come over here tonight. I'm happy to give you a hug. And, or maybe it needs a few days. I forget what they say. But in Israel, I got in early, even though I'm 42 and officially the 40 and up just started. But I teach 50 minutes a week at Chaviva High School. I teach Jewish history, and that got me onto the last list. So I was able to make it in, got my vaccine. Thank God, feeling fine. And in Israel, they're, like Mikhail says, it's just amazing. They're again, ignoring any stupid anti-Semitic lines from Saturday Night Live. They're so far into it that my daughter, who's an 18-year-old expat, she'll be 19 in May, 18-year-old expat, right? She's been vaccinated. And that shows how far they are. And like, okay, we think we're behind in America. Go look at Canada, where they don't even know what a vaccine is. But Mikhail, the answer is they've started. Restaurants are open again. But look, it's now, I think at this point in the process, if a rabbi doesn't mention the pandemic at least once in a class, they'll take his smicha away. I'll give you an example. Our good friend Donnie Zigdon. A lot of people here know Donnie, good friend of ours. Donnie's about 5 years younger than me. Perfect health, and he was just in the hospital with COVID. He got it. He had trouble breathing. Had to go in for oxygen and in a high fever. Thank God he's fine. He's home. We should continue to daven for his refuah shlema. Dan Yisrael ben Alma Gittel, but. So this is biological terrorism, not biological warfare, biological terrorism. And that, how does terrorism work? The terrorists can't fight you head on, so they instill fear in you by making random acts of terror. And that's, I think, what the coronavirus is. It's yes, most people get it will recover. I got it, thank God, I recovered. It wasn't a big deal for me. You got it, Mikhail, and you had no symptoms. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we were lucky. As a friend of mine said today, who is on his, I think, like third week of quarantine because his kids got it. And then the process of his kid, the 10 days of quarantine with his kids, he tested, I think, 3 times, 1 rapid and 2 PCR, negative. As he was on like his last day of quarantine, his wife got it and tested positive. So then he had to quarantine for another 10 days. And today is officially his 20th day of quarantine, I think. And he went for PCR test and hopefully he'll come back negative. I haven't heard yet. And I said, that's crazy, like 20 days of quarantine and for not having it. And he said, beats having the virus. And so, look, I think that Israel is trying to be smart, and that they were initially very smart. I wouldn't say they thought they had eradicated, but they thought they'd eradicated it early on, and they didn't. And it took them a long time to get back under control. So they're trying to be as careful as possible. But they have made the steps, and they will continue to make the steps. And we're all making the steps. And like anything in life, I think we have to be patient, and we have to just be sensitive to the system on this. I know there are those who disagree with me, and Mikhail, you're probably one of them. But I think that's what Israel's doing, and they are opening back up. And God willing, by the way, I'll give you an example. I got a letter today. So my daughter's not coming home for Pesach, and we were never planning to bring her home for Pesach. But it's been a big debate if yeshiva students and seminary girls are going to come home for Pesach, because as of yesterday, the government had not made any statement as to whether or not they could get back in the country. Today, a statement went out that all students who are coming home for Pesach will be able to come back in the country. So again, huge step forward. It was hard enough to get her there. I remember we had to do, and I've told the story, but huge step forward. Yeah, that's what I say about they made tremendous strides over there. It's amazing how quickly they roll out the vaccine, and how you'll see they're gonna help other countries. And that stupid Saturday Night Live canard, you're gonna see the exact opposite, because they're gonna be helping others get it. April 25th event is not in person. There might be a VIP dinner, which we're still debating, doing outside social distance, everyone at their own private table with their spouse or significant other dinner for the top donors. But no, it will be a virtual event and start off a 36-hour fundraising campaign. We kind of held off as long as we could to see if we should do in person or not. But to quote everyone else, as when are we going to open up and start doing Partners in Torah in person again at the Federation? And first of all, it's dependent on the Federation, but in general, like with these type of things, we have to kind of follow what everyone else is doing. And while we've done some small in-person social distance programming already, and we'll continue to, we do have to, for the bigger programs, be careful and follow what everyone else is doing for the sensitivity of others. Just that's the bottom line. It boils down to being sensitive. As a Jew, we have the concept of Kol Yisrael Re'evim Zed L'Zed, that we're all guarantors for one another. So if there are Jews who are still concerned about it, who don't have antibodies, who have not gotten the vaccine, have not had the opportunity for the vaccine, then we have to be sensitive to that. Now, according to what DeWine said, and we have, I think Gary is our only non-Clevelander here, but he's a Clevelander at heart. But DeWine said today, I think by May 1st, it should be that everyone in Ohio who wants the vaccine will be able to have gotten the vaccine, everyone 16 and over. So God willing, is in that, coupled with what the CDC said, I think in May we can get back to some in-person programming. The CDC said that in a room of vaccinated people, you can let your guard down. Again, they'll probably change it a few times. This is now they said you can be in that environment without a mask, and maybe we'll still have masks, maybe not, whatever it is. But hopefully, God willing, by the springtime, we can get back by Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer, I think is April 30th, April 31st. It's apropos. It's just apropos. Lag BaOmer is a day of. I've talked about this numerous times. It's the day of the Jewish phoenix. Right? You ever wonder what Lag BaOmer, and I gave, many of you have heard my class in Lag BaOmer that I gave last year, and I think I said I did over numerous times. But why is Lag BaOmer a holiday? It's a holiday because the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying from the pandemic that was going on, or the epidemic that was going on in Israel at the time. You know why they stopped dying? You know why? You don't know why they stopped dying? Because they were all dead, right? And that's a holiday? Like, okay, yeah, everyone's dead. 24,000 people gone. Yeah, let's celebrate. What in the world is a celebration like BaOmer? And not only that, but we celebrate by making these bonfires. It's like I always say, in Judaism, there's something for everybody. If you love the outdoors, you have Sukkot. If you love random diets, you have Pesach. If you love the trees, you have Tu B'Shvat. If you love being happy, you have Sukkot. I'm sorry, if you love dancing, you have Simchas Torah. If you love drinking, you have Purim. And if you happen to be a pyromaniac, you have Lag BaOmer, right? You got something for everyone when you're a Jew. But what's it all about? And as I always explain, I remember this was said over by Yanni Klein at Mendy Klein Zichron Levracha's funeral, that it's an idea from one of the commentators on Shulchan Aruch, I forget which one, that Lag BaOmer is not about what happened that day. It's about what happened. It's about what started that day. And that is, even though Rabbi Akiva had lost everything, I just spoke about this past Saturday night. My son made a siyum, and I had the privilege of flying to Norfolk, Virginia for the siyum. And I spoke about this idea that even though no one would have faulted Rabbi Akiva if he would have retired after everything he'd been through, after losing 24,000 students. Yet what did he do? He began to rebuild. He began to rebuild with 5 students. And that's what fire is. Fire is the ultimate concept of the phoenix, right? The rising from the fire, the rising of the phoenix. Fire is you take wood, and it looks like you're putting into a state of destruction, but through that state of destruction, you get this major source of energy, and that's what was represented by Lag BaOmer. That it looked like the destruction of Jewish scholarship from that point on, and from that, Rebbe Akiva rises and rebuilds, and because of that, we are here today. So I think it's apropos that DeWine basically said Lag BaOmer. Everyone 16 and older who's going to want a vaccine will get a vaccine, because Lag BaOmer, we're celebrating the end of a pandemic. But again, not the end of the pandemic. It's that when the pandemic ended, the Jewish people did not focus on what they had lost. They focused on what they were going to become. And I think that this will be you're hearing it here first. I'm thinking about this as I'm saying it. There's a new Rabbi Landis idea. And, because I repeat some of my old ideas, but this is, I think, what we're going to see over these next few months. We're going to see the Jewish people and the world as a whole really rise like a phoenix after this pandemic on Lag BaOmer, which is an apropos day. And until that point, I'll give you the famous words of the great poem of the Ibn Ezra, of Rabbi Ibn Ezra, great Spanish rabbi who had a terribly tumultuous life. So he said he was a great poet, and he wrote a beautiful poem that has the iambic pentameter or something like that. I forget what it's called, but in Hebrew, and I'll translate it to English where it's not going to have the same rhyme or flow, but the idea will be the same. So the poem in Hebrew is Ha'avar ayin, ha'asid adayin, ha'hove keheref ayin, daga menayin, which means that the past is gone. The future is not yet here. The present is the blink of an eye, so why worry? Right? And this was written by someone who had every reason to worry. Rav Avram Ibn Ezra had every reason to worry. He had lost his wife and one of his sons in a terribly tragic way. One of his other sons left the faith, left Judaism. He never was able to have a parnas, was never able to have sustenance, so much so that he once said in another poem about himself that if I would be a candle manufacturer, the sun would cease to set. And if I would be a burial shroud maker, the angel of death would retire. Right? That was his lack of success in business. And he wandered around most of his life, a terribly tragic figure in Jewish history. Yet he makes that point. And it's similar to what we said last week with the idea from the Chazon Ish, from Murray Friedman said last week. But I think that's the bottom line. We have to focus on the present. Can't focus on the past. It's gone. Can't focus on the future. It's not yet here yet. We have to make the best of the present. And God willing, we're going to look at a Lag BaOmer, and we're going to see the world led by the Jewish people rise like a phoenix, and amazing things to come. That's my thoughts on that. Okay. Any other questions, comments? So 2 weeks. Oh, wait. What's 2 weeks, Joanne? That's a cryptic statement there. So I just got to unmute.
I was answering your question when you're fully vaccinated. It's when it's 2 weeks after your second vaccination is when you should have full immunity.
Well, if America would listen to Israel, I was really fine a week ago, because in Israel, they say 3 months after you had the virus, get 1 shot, and then you're fully immune. So, but in America, they don't even look at if you had it or not. So I was probably, at least according to Israel, I was fully immune a week ago. But I'll know tomorrow, God willing, I'm going to give blood. Take care, Gary. So good to see you, buddy. I love seeing you here with us. We'll see you soon, okay? If I don't, hopefully I'll see you next week, but just in case not, have a Chag Kosher Sameach and be well. You're muted, so if you're trying to talk, we're not hearing you. But he's trying to unmute. Maybe I have to unmute you. I don't know. Maybe Naomi, you can unmute them. I don't know. There he goes.
All right. Great being with you. You hear me now?
I hear you now, buddy. It's so good to see you, Gary. Thank you.
Love checking in. You're keeping me moving ahead. Thank you very much. Shalom all.
That's what I'm here for. Be well, Gary. So yeah. Anyhow, so I'm giving blood tomorrow, so they'll do a antibodies test on, and I'll let you know where my antibodies stand tomorrow, or at least however long it takes, a couple days after that. Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns, good jokes, bad jokes? Anything else to say before we wrap it up tonight? Okay. Well,
quick, if that's okay.
What's that?
If it's okay for me to do a quick plug for an Israel Bonds event.
Go for it, Joanne. By all means. We already. By the way, you better tell Michael and Thomas that the plug that I made. You know.
So, if anybody's interested, we have a great event coming up April 12th for Yom HaZikaron It is going to be with the cast and director of Valley of Tears, which is partially about the Yom Kippur War. And there's also going to be, I can't remember, an intelligence agent from the IDF and representatives from Nahal, which they work a lot with trauma from the war and other issues. So, but it's going to be a really fantastic event. And I don't know if I can quickly type in the information to register, but you can
why
always
don't you take a minute and grab the link and put it there for us? Or
Yeah,
maybe, is it on the local Israel Bond site or the National Israel Bond site?
There's a national event set up on Facebook.
Let's see if I can
I'm
find
trying
it
to
here.
find it really quickly.
Thank you, Ron. Great to see you. I'm just trying to look myself because I would like to be there.
It is here.
You got it?
Yeah. See how fast it comes back. Oops. There. That is the link to register.
Awesome. Okay, good deal. As always, I want to thank everyone for being here. If you have any follow-up questions on anything what's that?
It's Natal, not Nahal. I apologize.
Okay, got it. If anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, follow up with me during the week, by all means, please reach out. You can go to my Facebook page and WhatsApp me or call me or whatever. And just thank you for being here and participating. Everyone have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we will see you, God willing, next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Take care.
Be well.